In the annals of the early American Republic, where the status of a black man was legally tethered to the soil as property, John Gloucester performed a feat of intellectual and spiritual alchemy. He didn't just escape the physical boundaries of the Tennessee frontier. He systematically dismantled the era's logic of racial inferiority by mastering the very tools, classical theology, reformed logic, and institutional leadership, used to exclude him. While others fought for freedom through flight, Gloucester fought for it through the pulpit and the pen, transforming a monosyllabic slave name into a dynastic legacy of black excellence. His story is not merely one of survival, but of the strategic engineering of a new class of American citizen, the black intellectual. The life of John Gloucester exists not merely as a collection of historical firsts, but as a profound masterclass in the architecture of black agency during the early American Republic. To understand Gloucester is to examine the precise mechanism by which a human being, legally classified as property, utilized the very intellectual and theological frameworks of his oppressors to dismantle the logic of his own enslavement. His narrative serves as a bridge between the frontier revivalism of the late 18th century and the sophisticated institutional autonomy of the 19th century Black church. Gloucester's significance is rooted in his ability to navigate the volatile intersection of Reformed theology and the burgeoning abolitionist sentiment of the North. He did not simply receive freedom. He engineered a multifaceted liberation that encompassed the intellectual, the spiritual, and the familial. By transforming himself from Jack to a pillar of the Presbyterian establishment, he provided an undeniable empirical rebuttal to the era's prevailing pseudoscientific theories regarding black intellectual inferiority. Todia, we explore the strategic maneuvers of a man who realized that for the black community to survive in a hostile republic, it required more than just a sanctuary. It required a pipeline for intellectual and political excellence. The genesis of John Gloucester's public life begins in the shadows of the American frontier, likely around 1776, within the confines of Kentucky or Blount County, Tennessee. In this landscape, identity for an enslaved person was a strictly utilitarian construct, imposed by the enslaver to denote ownership and function. He was known originally by the monosyllabic slave name Jack, a linguistic badge of his status as a body to be utilized rather than a soul to be reckoned with. The transition from this state of non-personhood to the status of a scholar and divine represents a deliberate, calculated reclamation of selfhood. The pivot point of Gloucester's life occurred through his interaction with the Reverend Gideon Blackburn. Blackburn, a frontier missionary of significant standing, functioned as the initial conduit through which Gloucester accessed the tools of the Enlightenment and Reformed tradition. While the power dynamic was inherently unequal, Blackburn purchased Gloucester with the explicit intent of molding him for the ministry. The relationship inadvertently created a crack in the edifice of chattel slavery. Blackburn's recognition of Gloucester's zeal for learning was a rare acknowledgement of black interiority in a society that preferred to view the enslaved as purely physical engines. The why behind this mentorship lies in the unique demands of the Second Great Awakening. The religious fervor of the era required effective communicators who could bridge cultural divides. However, the how of Gloucester's success was entirely his own. He approached theological training not just as a religious calling, but as a strategic asset, a means of acquiring the literacy and rhetorical polish necessary to advocate for his humanity within white ecclesiastical structures. In November 1806, Gloucester's intellectual journey reached a historic milestone when he became the first African-American student to attend Greenville College, now known as Tusculum University. This admission was not merely a personal achievement. It was a high-stakes performance of black capability. At a time when the skeptical era produced volumes of literature debating whether black individuals possessed the cognitive capacity for higher education, Gloucester's presence in the classroom functioned as a living counter-argument. His academic pursuit was an exercise in radical visibility. By mastering the classical curricula, theology, philosophy, and the rigors of Reformed logic, he neutralized the primary justification for his exclusion from the clergy. He understood that in the Presbyterian tradition, which prioritized a learned ministry, intellectual mastery was the only currency that could potentially bypass the barrier of race. This period of schooling served as the forge in which Jack was systematically dismantled to make way for the scholar who would eventually lead a movement. The ultimate manifestation of this reclamation occurred upon Gloucester's manumission at the age of 30. Freedom, in this context, was not a passive state, but an active, creative process. The act of discarding the name Jack in favor of John Gloucester was a declaration of institutional and personal sovereignty. The selection of John Gloucester was a calculated choice intended to project a specific image, that of the Black ecclesiastical dignity. Names like Jack were designed to be ephemeral and subservient. The name John Gloucester was designed to be etched into the annals of a denomination. This was the moment where he moved beyond being a protege of Gideon Blackburn and became an independent agent in the Atlantic world. By naming himself, he asserted that his identity was no longer a derivative of his master's will, but a product of his own intellectual and spiritual labor. This transformation set the stage for the next phase of his career, where the newly minted John Gloucester would have to leverage his hard-won identity to navigate the treacherous waters of the Philadelphia Presbytery and the literal marketplaces where his family remained in peril. While John Gloucester had secured his own physical and intellectual autonomy, he remained tethered to the institution of slavery through the bodies of his wife and children. This period of his life illustrates the double burden inherent to Black leadership in the early Republic, the exhausting requirement to satisfy the rigorous, often pedantic standards of white institutional gatekeepers while simultaneously laboring in the literal marketplace to ransom one's own kin. Upon arriving in Philadelphia, Gloucester faced a barrier that was ostensibly academic but functionally systemic. The Philadelphia Presbytery, despite acknowledging his piety and oratorical skill, initially denied him ordination. The stated justification involved deficiencies in his mastery of classical languages, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. This move served as a gatekeeping mechanism. By emphasizing the learned aspect of the Presbyterian ministry, the presbytery could maintain a racial hierarchy under the guise of maintaining educational standards. Gloucester's response was a masterclass in tactical patience. Rather than succumbing to frustration, he returned to Tennessee, where the Union Presbytery, more familiar with his character and the frontier's urgent need for capable ministers, ordained him on April 13, 1810. This maneuver allowed him to return to Philadelphia not as a supplicant, but as a peer. By navigating the internal politics of the denomination across state lines, he utilized the decentralized nature of Presbyterian governance to bypass local prejudice. With his credentials secured, Gloucester's primary focus shifted to a harrowing race against time. His wife and children remained enslaved in Tennessee, their lives subject to the whims of creditors and the volatility of the domestic slave trade. The reason behind his relentless fundraising was the constant threat of family separation, a fundamental tool of control used by the plantocracy. To achieve their physical redemption, Gloucester embarked on an arduous series of preaching tours throughout the North and even across the Atlantic to England. He transformed the pulpit into a platform for a specific type of capitalistic abolitionism. He had to perform a delicate rhetorical dance, appealing to the conscience of white congregants without appearing radical enough to alienate them. Each sermon was a transaction, where his eloquence was traded for the literal currency of his family's freedom. The mechanics of this success was found in his ability to embody the respectable Black man archetype that white reformers found palatable. By presenting himself as the pinnacle of Reformed morality and intellectual achievement, he made the enslavement of his family appear as a theological and moral absurdity to his audiences. By 1815, through sheer oratorical labor, he had raised the necessary funds to reunite his family in Philadelphia, proving that for a Black man in America, the domestic sphere was not a given right, but a territory that had to be bought back from the state. The establishment of the First African Presbyterian Church, FAPC, in Philadelphia was not merely the founding of a house of worship. it was the construction of a fortress for Black intellectual and social life. Gloucester understood that for a marginalized community, a church must function as a multi-purpose engine for survival and advancement. The FAPC, founded in 1807 and formally housed in its own building by 1811 at 7th and Shippen Streets, represented a departure from the hush harbors of the South or the integrated, yet segregated, balconies of white northern churches. The mechanics of this institutional birth was rooted in Gloucester's insistence on Reformed theology. While many Black worshippers gravitated toward the emotional spontaneity of Methodism or baptism, Gloucester leaned into the structured, intellectual rigor of Presbyterianism. He recognized that the Presbyterian system of elders and sessions provided a framework for self-governance. By adopting this model, he granted Black men and women the opportunity to hold titles, manage finances, and exercise judicial authority within their own community, roles that were strictly denied to them in the secular world. The church was a laboratory for citizenship. Under Gloucester's stewardship, the FAPC became the epicenter of a benevolent empire within the Black community. He realized that spiritual salvation was hollow if it did not address the material precariousness of his congregants. He facilitated the creation of mutual aid societies and insurance groups that provided for the sick and buried the dead, bypassing white institutions that often refused service to Black citizens. This institutional building was a strategic response to the systemic exclusion of Black people from the emerging American middle class. Gloucester utilized the church's physical space as a sanctuary for education and a hub for information exchange. By the time of his passing in 1822, he had grown the congregation to nearly 300 members, creating a stable, educated, and economically connected enclave in the heart of Philadelphia. He did not just build a church. He engineered a template for Black institutional sustainability that would be replicated across the North for the next century. As Gloucester's influence expanded beyond the walls of the First African Presbyterian Church, he transitioned into the role of a public intellectual. He understood that the survival of the Black community depended on more than spiritual fortitude. It required a rigorous defense of their right to exist as full participants in the American experiment. His work during this era focused on the dual pillars of educational infrastructure and the rejection of forced expatriation. In 1818, Gloucester co-founded the Pennsylvania Augustine Society for the Education of People of Color. This was not merely a literacy program, it was a philosophical statement. By arguing that education was the handmaid of religion, he posited that intellectual development was a prerequisite for true spiritual and civic maturity. The methodology of this advocacy was rooted in his rejection of the vocational-only model of education, often pushed upon the Black working class. Instead, Gloucester championed a classical and theological curriculum. He believed that mastery of logic, rhetoric, and history was the primary method for dismantling the psychological remnants of slavery. To Gloucester, a mind trained in the rigors of Reformed thought was a mind that could no longer be held in mental or physical bondage. His Sunday school became a laboratory for this pedagogy, producing a generation of thinkers who viewed intellectual excellence as a form of resistance. One of the most critical moments in Gloucester's career was his firm opposition to the American Colonization Society, ACS. The ACS, a group primarily composed of white elites, argued that free Black people should be returned to Africa, ostensibly to avoid racial conflict in the United States. Gloucester's stance was a radical assertion of belonging. He argued that African Americans were not aliens to be deported, but rightful citizens of the land they had built with their own labor and defended with their own blood. The catalyst for this resistance was his recognition that colonization was a sophisticated form of ethnic cleansing designed to remove the most educated and vocal advocates for abolition from American soil. By staying and demanding his rights within the Republic, Gloucester asserted that Blackness and Americanness were not mutually exclusive, but were fundamentally intertwined. The true measure of John Gloucester's impact is found not in his individual accolades, but in the lineage of leadership he successfully engineered. He did not merely build a church, he constructed a pipeline for Black excellence that would influence American history for decades after his death. Gloucester's most immediate legacy was his 4 sons, Jeremiah, Stephen, James, and John Jr., all of whom entered the Presbyterian ministry. This was an unprecedented achievement in the early 19th century, creating a dynasty of Black intellectualism. Each son took the tools their father had gathered and applied them to different fronts of the struggle. Stephen Gloucester, for instance, became a powerhouse of the mid-19th century, founding the Lombard Street Central Presbyterian Church and serving as a prominent voice in the abolitionist movement. James Gloucester established the Siloam Presbyterian Church in Brooklyn, becoming a confidant to radical abolitionist John Brown. This multi-generational commitment to the learned ministry ensured that the Gloucester name became a brand for Black institutional stability and radical intellectualism. Beyond his biological children, Gloucester's Sunday school and mentorship programs produced some of the most significant figures in African American history. Samuel Cornish, the co-founder of Freedom's Journal, the first Black-owned newspaper in the U.S., was a product of Gloucester's ecclesiastical environment. Likewise, Jonathan C. Gibbs, who would eventually serve as the first Black Secretary of State of Florida during Reconstruction, was educated within the traditions Gloucester established. The how of this influence was the creation of a mentor-protege network that functioned as an underground university. Gloucester provided the social capital, the library, and the rhetorical training that allowed these men to enter the halls of government and the offices of the press. He understood that a leader's greatest work is not what they do, but who they empower to follow them. John Gloucester passed away in 1822, his body exhausted by the double burden of redeeming his family and building a denomination. Yet, he died as a man who had successfully rewritten the script of his own life. He had moved from the obscurity of a frontier slave named Jack to the prominence of a scholar whose name was respected across the Atlantic. His life provides a blueprint for how marginalized people utilize the structures of power, in this case, the Presbyterian Church, to carve out spaces of autonomy. He proved that theology could be a tool of liberation, that the classroom could be a site of rebellion, and that the family unit was a territory worth any price to defend. John Gloucester did not just witness history, he engineered it, leaving behind a legacy of institutional strength that continues to inform the architecture of Black leadership today. The life of John Gloucester challenges us to consider the intersection of faith and agency in our own time. His journey prompts a vital question for the modern listener. In what ways do we use our intellectual and spiritual resources to dismantle contemporary barriers to justice? Gloucester did not see theology as a private comfort, but as a public weapon. To honor his legacy is to reflect on the manner in which our own learned ministry, regardless of our specific field, serves the broader community. We must examine whether we are merely occupying spaces of influence or, like Gloucester, actively building pipelines that allow others to follow. For those seeking to continue the rigorous intellectual tradition that Gloucester championed, staying engaged with the evolution of religious and social thought is essential. Gloucester's commitment to a learned ministry lives on in the scholarship of today. To explore the current landscape of faith, ethics, and the role of the church in the public square, consider deepening your study through modern resources. Subscribe to Theology today to access insights that bridge the gap between historical tradition and the pressing theological questions of the 21st century. By engaging with this channel, you participate in the same tradition of intellectual excellence that allowed a frontier scholar to transform the American landscape.